As you know, tonight we are presenting the book by Stefano Vaccara, Carlo Marcello, The Man Behind the JFK Assassination. And before we get started, I want to remind you that there are copies of the book. I think for the first time in the history of the Casa, we actually have them at the same time in Italian and English. Never happens. We presented several books that were published in both countries, but we never had the fortune of having them together. Tonight they're all here, so you can choose either the Italian version or the English version of the book upstairs, and Stefano will be happy to sign them for you. Stefano Vaccara is, and I don't say this in general, but in very precise terms, is a very good friend of Casa Italiana. He has been for a very long time. We have experienced his generosity in participating to our events when requested, in the abundant, precise, and intelligent coverage of our events that he has provided, both for America Oggi, Oggi Sette, the weekly cultural supplement of America Oggi that we all regret not to see anymore, and finally now with his new venture, La Voce di New York, that, as you know, is the online newspaper that he founded about a year ago. Right, Stefano? Almost a year ago, so it's almost 1 year. Stefano is a journalist of a rare breed that intersects a very strong and solid historical background, as you will see also from the book that he has written and that we are presenting tonight, with the feature of an American investigative journalist, rather uncommon in Italian journalists. So I would say that he's an American journalist who happened to have an Italian passport. Is that right? And as a compliment, obviously. And again, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about something that he wrote, to talk about his book, a book that has already raised several reactions, including some reactions that we received when we advertised the evening via email. A lady wrote to us saying that Carlo Marcello was not deported. He was abducted, sequestered, taken to the jungle, something like that. I mean, he's touching on very, very sensitive issues. I'm not going to go into the details because we have a wonderful panel that is with us to help us with that. We have Joseph La Palombara, who is the Arnold Wolfers Professor of Political Science and Management Emeritus at Yale University. Professor La Palombara, too, has been to the Casa several times. I'm always impressed by his brilliant mind, his formidable memory, and his incredibly deep knowledge of anything that has to do with Italian history, Italian politics, Italian diplomacy, all things that he not only studied but lived in the first person in his many activities and appointments in Italy. And I'm very grateful to him for being here with us tonight. I just remember one of his fundamental books, Democracy Italian Style. And I assure you that the book, even if it referred to the time between World War II and the end of World War II in 1985, 86, when the book was written, it could still be read with profit now. I don't think the style of Italian democracy has changed much from when you described it, Professor La Palombara. And finally, we have George De Stefano, who is a writer, has an incredibly well-done website that I invite you to visit. He blogs frequently. He writes also for major publications, including The Nation, Newsday, The Advocate, Phil Comment, again, Lesbian Review, and many others. We invited him tonight especially for his nonfiction book that he published a few years ago, An Offer We Can't Refuse, The Mafia in the Mind of America. It is a book that concentrates on the representation of the mafia in literature, cinema, and so on. So we couldn't be more fortunate to have such an exciting panel of experts tonight, and I would like to invite you to start your tweets. And let's start also with the video with which we are beginning. It's a video that Stefano recorded with the help of a friend. Remind me the name of... Jesse Walker is the producer and director. Where is Jesse? Right there. Thank you very much.
He's a friend and did it to me. He's a professional. You will see.
Thank you, Jesse, for letting us use your video. And it's going to be a great introduction to the book that is going to give us most of the background information we need to be transported into the core essence of the book. Enjoy the video, and after that, our panel is going to take the stage. Thank you, and enjoy the evening.
Carlos Marcello, born Calogero Minacori, from Sicilian parents. They were born in Ravanusa, provincia di Agrigento, in Sicily. He was the boss, the mafia boss of New Orleans. He controlled not only Louisiana, he controlled Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, included Dallas. And in November 1963, he organized the assassination on President Kennedy. He started with the petty crimes, but soon he understood that he wanted power. And more than money, he wanted power. And that is what mafia is. In 1959, Senator John Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, they are part of a commission. They're investigating the relationship between trade unions and the mafia. And they interrogate Marcello. Robert Kennedy understood the power of Marcello and called Marcello to answer questions in Washington. And that is when we have the first encounter between the Kennedy's brother and Carlos Marcello. And in that occasion, Robert Kennedy will say to Marcello, "You are a person that don't deserve to stay in this country, and I will kick you out." In 1961, just a few months after the inauguration, Robert Kennedy he became the Attorney General. He is right away the most powerful Attorney General that this country ever had. Remember, he's the brother of the president, and his first mission is to go after the mafia. In 1961, Carlos Marcello is kidnapped by federal agents sent by Robert Kennedy. He's practically left in Guatemala. He was left in the jungle, and in the jungle he almost died. This man is 50 years old, left there alone, without money, without clothes, but he's able to make it, and he's able to come back. After a few months, he comes back in the country, and he starts a duel with the Kennedys, and the vendetta of the mafia will be horrible. The target of Carlos Marcello will be always Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General. But how Sicilian says, and he actually said that to some of his other friends mafiosi, he said, in order to have the dog stop biting you, you don't cut the tail, you have to chop the head. So Robert Kennedy is the tail, the head is the president. Lee Harvey Oswald was a former Marine. He defected in Soviet Union. Then he went back to the United States and he ended up to go to Dallas. But in the summer of 1963, he went back to his hometown. His hometown was New Orleans. He was born and raised in New Orleans, but without a father. Who raised him was his uncle, Charles Dutz Moret. Charles Dutz Moret was the bookie of Carlos Marcello. He worked for him for many years, and in the summer of 1963, Carlos Marcello was looking for the right person to be in Dallas in November 1963. The man that shot Oswald in the police station of Dallas, Jack Ruby, well, Jack Ruby works for Carlos Marcello. In any murder, a detective has to look for motive, means, and opportunity. But when it's a mafia assassination of an important public figure, you need two more ingredients. Blackmailing, the mafia has to be able to blackmail anyone that is trying to come to get them for justice. And then the victim, the target that they choose, is being isolated by the establishment. In the summer of 1963, John Kennedy was a president that was loved by the people, but started to have a lot of problems with establishment. I think America doesn't know the truth yet, but American citizens need to handle the truth, because in a democracy, truth is justice. And without justice, you don't have democracy. Everything is out there. Documents, FBI, CIA documents, and especially Congress. Congress did a lot, helped a lot, because Congress put it together thousands of documents in investigation. It's easy to connect all the dots, and you can see that Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of New Orleans, he's the major suspect, because Carlos Marcello is always there with Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. For some reason, still today, when you ask, do you know who is Carlos Marcello? Practically no one tells you that he is the man behind the Kennedy assassination.
Everyone has a pretty good, an accurate recollection of where one was on the 23rd of November in 1963, just as we remember where we were on September 11th, not too many years ago. It turns out that on both of these occasions, I happened to be in Italy. In 1963, I then lived in Vigna Clara at the north end of Rome, and walked in through the door, and our au pair said, Professor Negri is on the telephone, and it was a friend from Montecitorio who asked me whether I'd talk to my embassy, and I said, why would I want to do that? And he said, well, your president has been shot and in Dallas, and so and he said, and turn on the TV, which I did. I couldn't get into the embassy, as my friend Burnett will understand why. Within just a very few minutes, we all understood that John Kennedy had died in Texas, the victim of Lee Harvey Oswald. The Italian mass media canceled all programs, and for the next day, about 24 hours, what we heard on television and the radio was simply classical music. The shock at that time was obviously felt around the world, and I confess to being a member of a declining minority of people. I, for a long time, believed what the Warren Commission found, namely that the assassination was the act of one person. And this may strike a number of you as extremely naive, particularly in view of the fact that at this stage of the game, it's in the neighborhood of 8 of every 10 Americans does not believe that that was the case, that there must have been more than one person involved. And what Stefano's book has helped me to do is to join the other side and to understand that there must have been something really quite ominous, very carefully planned about that particular political murder, which is what an assassination actually is. So the book itself, I read it first in Italian, and we talked about it with Stan Burnett. Came up to Yale with Stefano to talk about the book there, and then I've seen the English translation. I'm a person who's always been, every time I've looked at a translation of something I've written in a language that I can understand, I've been absolutely shocked, not positively. And so I should say right off the bat that I prefer the Italian to the English language version of his book. Maybe it's because Italian sentences that are intended to shock are much more effective, I think, than the English counterpart. And there are plenty of sentences of that kind in this book. The most shocking of these, for me at least, is the argument in this book, which I think is extremely and assiduously pursued, is that a man named Calogero Minacori, a Sicilian, who came to this country, named Carlos Marcello, was basically the person who organized this assassination. There are things I've learned in this book that were, for me, quite telling. I grew up on the mean streets of Chicago. And we Chicagoans really believed we had one of the really most interesting and effective and well-organized underworld organizations on earth, headed not necessarily by the mafioso. The guy who ran the underworld in Chicago when I was a kid, this was after Frank Nitti was himself assassinated, was a man named Murray the Camel Humphrey, so that the leadership positions were passed around at that time. But I had no idea that down there in New Orleans, there was a guy named Carlos Marcello who, in effect, was running the oldest mafioso organization in the United States of such magnitude that on a per capita basis, the New Orleans Mafia was clearly doing immensely better than the Mafia in my hometown of Chicago or anywhere else in the United States. What really shocked me was that I, who at that time was not Joseph La Palombara, P-A-L-O-M, not P-O-L-O-M, I was Joseph Marcello, if you like. And I had that name from the time I was 8 years old until the time I went to college. I might have been extremely more, I think, respected, if nothing else, in my teen years in Chicago, if we had known more about Carlos than we did at that time. In any event, what we have here is a book that points us in the direction of at least giving very serious consideration to the possibility that if you are among those who do not believe that it was one madman in 1963 who decided to assassinate an American president, but there must have been something more to it than that, then I think you will really enjoy reading this book, which is going to challenge you to make up your own mind as to how you feel about the evidence that's adduced. I hope that Stefano can tell us something more about the degree that he's relied on Mafia Kingfish, the Davis book. I have my own somewhat skeptical feelings about that book, but that's really quite beside the point. I think the book is worth reading because you will have an opportunity to weigh what's in there and to make up your own mind as to how persuasive is the evidence regarding Carlos Marcello as the, if you like, the person who brought about this terrible thing. The government seems to me to have misbehaved here in ways that it should have avoided. It is certainly true that Carlos Marcello made a really bad mistake in the sense that he was one of these Sicilians who decided not to become naturalized, and this made him an easy target for an attorney general who was really, really out to get this person in some fashion either convicted and jailed, or if not that, deported from the United States. At one point, as the film suggests, he does get deported to Guatemala because neither Italy nor France, as you'll see in this book, would accept him, Carlos Marcello. He gets deported from the United States on the basis of a phony birth certificate that the government concocted in order to remove him from the United States. And it was a federal court who, after that particular act had taken place and was appealed throughout the conviction of Marcello on grounds that it was based on falsified evidence. This man became a criminal when he was 18 years old. He served almost a decade in prison. He obviously had all kinds of connections with the likes of Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, names we all know about. Both the Warren Commission and a Senate committee that investigated the assassination of the president had allegations made to the effect that this man might in fact be the organizer of the whole thing. And both of these organizations threw out that contention as unsustainable. This must have been one of the reasons why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Last year in his talking with Charlie Rose on television on the 50th anniversary of the assassination, this must be one of the reasons why Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when he is asked a direct question about his attitude toward the Warren Commission, in effect described it as, and this is a quote in the book, as a very shoddy investigation. So what we have then is pages that you can peruse yourselves to make up your own minds, as I say, and I'm going to wind it up here for the moment in any event and have my co-presenter take the floor. It seems to me that you have in this book a very persuasive notion that Marcello had the motive, the means, the opportunity, the blackmailing capacity, and finally the fifth thing that Stefano mentioned, a kind of political atmosphere in which there were quite a few members of the establishment who would not have minded to see John F. Kennedy disappear from the White House as one of the ways of getting at the Robert F. Kennedy that Carlos Marcello certainly had every reason for detesting, in particular because, as he once apparently put it, Carlos Marcello felt that he was being subjected to a real indignity because on the Senate committee of which Robert Kennedy was the chief investigator and his brother John was a member, the McClellan Committee, he was being harassed by Robert, one of the sons of Joseph Kennedy, who Marcello, of course, indicated and remembered, made his millions as a bootlegger dealing directly with the likes of Frank Costello and the others. But to conclude, the burden of Vaccara, of Stefano Vaccara's argument goes like this. He believes it is far-fetched to think that, 1, only Oswald was involved in the actual shooting that occurred in Dallas 50 years ago. 2, that Ruby's armed presence in the Dallas police headquarters was a random act. 3, that Ruby's cancer, the alleged cancer, and his death occurs only after he had refused, agrees to go to Washington, D.C. to testify. 4, 5 years after all of this, another random act occurs, namely another madman succeeds in public, as you'll remember, in murdering the president's brother, and 5, that during the first 48 hours of Oswald's incarceration in Dallas, the police failed to record any of his statements because the department said it lacked the funds to buy a tape recorder. Maybe we can take some of that up in a few minutes.
Good evening, buonasera. In introducing me, Stefano Albertini mentioned the title of a book that I wrote a few years back called An Offer We Can't Refuse, The Mafia in the Mind of America, in which I try to examine this long-running fascination of American popular culture with the mafia narrative, the myth of the mafia, with Italian-American and Italian organized crime. And in the book, I devoted quite a bit of a discussion to The Godfather, of course, the film. I don't need to talk about the film's importance in American cinema history, but I mention it because of the figure of Don Vito Corleone, who has since become mythic, first from the novel and then from the Godfather films. So, to understand Carlos Marcello, I think in some ways you have to look at Vito Corleone. And I think Carlos Marcello, of all the notorious crime bosses who have operated in America, he was the most like the archetypal Sicilian mafia don. And for us, that's Vito Corleone. That's the character who sort of crystallizes that image in our minds. And you'll remember the famous lines of dialogue from The Godfather. You remember Saluzzo saying to Don Corleone, I need a man who has powerful friends. I need Don Corleone, all of those politicians that you carry around in your pocket like so many nickels and dimes. And then there's the famous scene of the meeting of the 5 families where Tattaglia says to another mob leader, Barzini, yes, he was too modest. He had all the judges and politicians in his pocket, and he refused to share them. And Don Barzini echoes this, saying Don Corleone had all the judges and politicians in New York, and he must share them. He must let us draw the water from the well. So Carlos Marcello really was the kind of mafioso that had that sort of power. He had a vast wealth and a network of business and political connections that ensured he would never be subordinate to anyone. Marcello, like a true Sicilian mafia leader, sought out beneficial alliances with politicians, but he never approached them hat in hand or with deference. A quote from Giovanni Falcone, the great anti-mafia magistrate assassinated by Cosa Nostra in 1992, sums this up quite well, even though Falcone was talking about Sicily and not the United States. If it is true that a fair number of Sicilian politicians have been, to all intents and purposes, adepts of Cosa Nostra, it is also true that within the mafia as an organization, they have never enjoyed particular prestige because of their political origins. In short, Cosa Nostra is so strong, compact, and independent that it can speak and make alliances with whomever it chooses, but never from a subordinate position. So, as mentioned, Marcello never saw himself as subordinate to everyone, even though he had virtually no formal education, spoke English very poorly, basically illiterate, was physically unprepossessing, a very small man, about 5 feet tall. But his power was huge. Stefano have talked about what is mafia, what is mafioso, what is organized crime. And one way to look at mafia, I think, is when criminal enterprises engage in relations of reciprocity with the establishment, with politicians and public institutions. And Carlos Marcello was a master of building and maintaining those kinds of relationships. We're not talking about bribing beat cops not to interfere with numbers running or rounding up votes for a favored politician, although they certainly did that. We're talking about the construction of a criminal empire aided and abetted by elected officials, police departments, prosecutors, and judges that extended from its home base in New Orleans throughout the state of Louisiana and beyond to Mississippi and Texas, as the short film pointed out. And of course, that presence in Texas would be crucial to Marcello's plans to eliminate his great enemy, John Kennedy, which would have had the effect of ending the increasingly aggressive investigations led by the president's younger brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. As has been mentioned, Stefano Vaccara is not the first journalist to connect Marcello to JFK's assassination, but I think it took a Sicilian journalist like him to explain Marcello's mentality and behavior and how the Kennedy assassination bears the earmarks of a mafia plot that would result in a cadavere eccellente, an illustrious corpse. Vaccara's book does owe substantial debts to two previous ones, a debt he acknowledges to John Davis's Mafia Kingfish, Carlos Marcello and the assassination of President Kennedy by organized crime from 1989, and more recently, Legacy of Secrecy by Lamar Waldron and Tom Hartman from 2009. Davis's book is an important source for its, I think, its thorough reporting of Marcello's rise to power. Some people have raised questions about some aspects of the book, and there was a lawsuit by someone written about in the book against the author. But it is, I do recommend that you read it. It's long and complicated and it's not always easy to follow all its narrative skeins. And Stefano Vaccara's book has the virtue of condensing much of Davis's research, as well as other sources, into a clear, logical, and to me very engrossing narrative. As Stefano Vaccara states at the outset, for a major assassination to be called a mafia hit, 5 ingredients are required: motive, means, opportunity, blackmail of any potential avengers, and a favorable political context that the target is a threat to the establishment. Vaccara then states the assassination of President Kennedy fulfills all 5 requirements. And he states, this book will provide the motive, the method, and the proof beyond a reasonable doubt as to how and why he was murdered in Dallas in 1963. That is a big and startling claim to make, but it's one that I'm pretty much persuaded by, and I think it's certainly far more credible than the literally incredible lone gunman conclusion of the Warren Report, or Richard Posner's recent Case Closed, which tried to support the Warren Report's claims, or Fox TV blowhard Bill O'Reilly's Killing Kennedy, to really go down the food chain. In his book, Stefano methodically reviews and synthesizes the evidence that what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, quote, certainly was a mafia hit, as he says. What is puzzling is the fact that given so much evidence pointing to Marcello's involvement, that evidence had not been followed to its logical conclusion. Vaccara notes that the case would remain frozen for 15 years after the Dallas tragedy. And even after a 2-year investigation by a congressional committee established that Carlos Marcello, quote, more than anyone else should be singled out as the number one suspect in the Kennedy assassination, that conclusion, quote, failed to move America's public consciousness, end quote. Besides the clarity of Vaccara's account and his particular insights as a Sicilian journalist, the book has the virtue of not being filiopietistic, but rather candid and honest, and not only about the Kennedy assassination and Marcello's role, but also about some issues that many Italian Americans would prefer not to acknowledge. Vaccara is not an Italian American, although since he now lives in Brooklyn, maybe he might disagree, but a Sicilian from Palermo who is unafraid to go where anti-defamationists and others concerned with the Italian American image fear to tread. It's not that he's insensitive to Italian Americans' concerns about mafia stereotyping and ethnic defamation. He's just not bound by them. Take, for example, the history of Sicilian migration to New Orleans. There have been books that documented that history, focusing on the immigrant struggles and their eventual assimilation into New Orleans' rich ethnic gumbo. The typical narrative arc goes like this. They came, they were poor and mistreated, but through hard work, strong families, and religious faith, they triumphed over obstacles and achieved the American dream. That narrative, of course, is true in its broad outlines, but it's a tad simplistic. As Vaccara and others have established, including the Sicilian historian Salvatore Lupo in his History of the Mafia, Sicilian immigration in New Orleans also brought the mafia to America. Sicilians began immigrating to New Orleans in 1816. By the end of the 19th century, the city had the largest Sicilian colony in the United States. The immigrants were drawn by the climate, similar to Sicily's, but more so by work and agriculture and the lucrative and expanding business in produce. Fruit and vegetable exports from Palermo began to rise in 1850, and New Orleans became one of the most important destinations for that produce. The lucrative business of fruits and vegetables in the expanding world market was a magnet for the mafia, Vaccara notes. New Orleans became, quote, the ideal marketplace for the mafia from the mid-1800s, Vaccara notes, also because the disorganized and corrupt city administration provided a favorable business climate for organized crime, which leads to his discussion of one of the most notorious incidents in New Orleans history, the murder in 1891 of the city's police chief, David Hennessy, and the subsequent mob lynching of 11 Sicilians who had been tried and acquitted of the crime. The lynchings are often portrayed as a virulent expression of pre-existing festering prejudice against Sicilians who were killed just because they were Sicilians. But the truth, as is often the case, was more complicated. In New Orleans, two Sicilian cosche, or clans, the Matrangas and the Provenzanos, both from Monreale in Sicily, were fighting for control of the New Orleans port and the produce unloaded from the ships. Police Chief Hennessy, Stefano notes it in the book, seemed to be leaning in favor of the Provenzanos. Of the 19 suspects arrested for Hennessy's murder, 6 were tied to the Matranga clan and to another, that of Joseph Macheca, who was also a foe of the Provenzanos. Macheca was one of the victims of the lynch mob that broke into the jail. As Vaccara notes, the other mafioso, Carlo Matranga, managed to hide under a garbage heap and survived. So the book notes that the New Orleans Sicilian Mafia, therefore, was not just first to appear with all its firepower on the American scene, it was also destined to become and remain the most opaque and unpredictable among the criminal organizations in North America, unquote. By the time its roots go back to 1860, with the first boss of the New Orleans Mafia, Raffaele Agnello, assuming leadership in 1865. So by the 1880s, it was well entrenched in the city of New Orleans. By the time Carlos Marcello became the leader of the New Orleans Mafia in the late 1940s, Cosa Nostra had been a thriving enterprise for decades. It flourished there for so long, and in large measure because, quote, in the big city more than any other American city, the top politicians and civil servants learned how to share power and profits with the bosses of the oldest mafia family in the United States, end quote. The claim that New Orleans was the cradle of the mafia in America and the one closest to its Sicilian origins would always be acknowledged by the other mafia families throughout the United States. And with the assassination of JFK, Carlos Marcello reached the apex of his power, and apparently we can say he got away with it. Instead of spending his last days in prison or dying in a prison hospital like, say, John Gotti, he died at home in his bed at 83, surrounded by his family, a fact that no doubt mightily impressed mafiosi back in Sicily. One would hope that Stefano Vaccara's important new book will have an impact beyond enlightening readers about the mafia conspiracy that killed the president. And there has been talk, and apparently this is going to happen. The director, David O. Russell, whose current film is American Hustle, has been planning a film based on the Waldron Hartman book, Legacy of Secrecy, that I mentioned earlier. As of fall 2013, this film project is still on to Directed by David O. Russell with Leonardo DiCaprio as an FBI agent who investigated Marcello and Robert De Niro as the mafia boss in New Orleans. I think they're going to have to shrink De Niro a bit to get him down to Marcello's diminutive size. But even if the unbelievable conclusion of the Warren Commission were to remain the official version, and there's one consolation. Carlos Marcello's mafia is now pretty much extinct in New Orleans. A retired federal prosecutor, Sicilian-American born and raised in New Orleans, recently told me in an interview, "We don't have a mob presence here per se anymore. The biggest problem is public corruption, and you find that in any major city in the United States. But there's no mob family anymore that presents itself as a threat. In fact, there's no FBI squad here in New Orleans dedicated to fighting organized crime. The descendants of Marcello are still around, but they're in legitimate business. They chose other career paths." And this ex-prosecutor, who is himself a Sicilian-American, told me about his father, a truck driver whose family had firsthand experience of mafia corruption when they lost their vineyard in Sicily to a mafia clan. So, and he told me, he went on to say that this prosecutor, "I went to school with the children of Anthony Carolla, Carlos Marcello's underboss. My father said, stay away from these people. They are the people who caused most of the problems for the Italians in New Orleans." And I kind of knew that because when I was growing up, I heard all about that. Every time Carlos Marcello would come on TV, during my childhood, he was always on TV. So every time he came on TV, my dad would say, "This is the guy who has caused the Italians more trouble in this city than anybody else." You'd see Marcello in a silk suit, smoking a big cigar. My dad didn't even own a suit. And when JFK was assassinated, my father said, "I bet these bastards had something to do with it." So I think even in New Orleans, there was a sense, at least among some people, that Marcello and the New Orleans Cosa Nostra was involved with the assassination. There's another book that came out a few years ago called Mr. New Orleans, and it's the memoirs of a mafia pimp, basically, a French Cajun mafia pimp who worked for Carlos Marcello. And in the book, I was startled to read when I read this a few years ago, he talks quite openly about seeing Lee Harvey Oswald with Carlos Marcello and seeing him at businesses and establishments that Marcello and his cronies owned or managed. And he was quite convinced, he goes by the name Frenchy Brouillette, that Carlos Marcello was indeed the author of the Kennedy assassination. So with Stefano Vaccara's book and hopefully a forthcoming film from David O. Russell, maybe we'll, some of the truth about who actually killed JFK will get into the public consciousness. Thanks.
Thank you very much to everybody to be here. I have to thank, before I do my short, because a lot was said, so I want to go then on maybe some questions that you have. I want to thank Professor La Palombara. They came here from New Haven, and he didn't mention something that I want to mention, that he was involved when he was a professor in Michigan. He actually was also involved with Robert Kennedy in as advising. Robert Kennedy. The Kennedys were having young people at the time, young professor, young thing, giving good ideas. He was one of them, and you forgot to mention something that you mentioned to me, that in one of those flights to Washington, he was sitting with the lawyer of Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was, well, you know probably who Jimmy Hoffa was, but he was a big friend of Carlos Marcello, probably involved with Carlos Marcello in the assassination. But before the assassination, of course, he was, you mentioned to me that the lawyer of Jimmy Hoffa was pretty angry with how Robert Kennedy was handling his clients, because he was not respecting the Constitution of the United States, right? And that was the case, actually, because Carlos Marcello is true. Who called you or wrote you, Stefano Albertini? She was right. The Constitution of the United States was not respected when Carlos Marcello was kid. But I want to thank Professor La Palombara. I want to thank George Di Stefano. I expected that who read the book liked the book, because I'm a journalist, so I wrote it in the way it has to be, I don't say entertaining, because I hope that what I wrote is truth. So it doesn't be just entertainment, but that somebody could say, oh, well written, nice, I enjoy it. But to also the endorsement that both of you did, and I want to thank Professor La Palombara told you that he, before reading this book, believed on the Warren Commission practically, and making my book something that can change the idea of a very important Yale professor. For me is a big, big honor. But then I want to thank, there are several people here that contributed on the book. I see Professor Sal Rotella there. I was with him at the Met once when I was telling him about the book, thinking had to write this book, if you remember. I was thinking, I have an idea, I want to write about this, thinking that he will tell me, are you crazy? Are you not going to? And when he just heard the 2-3 things, that was, why I wanted to write the book, he said, you have to do it. Stefano, do it. You have to do it. And then, of course, going along, he gave me the advices and others. My mentor, that he's sitting also here, Stanton Burnett. Dr. Burnett was with Professor La Palombara in Italy as a diplomat. He knows very well Italy, and he's written books. He's a former Center for Strategic and International Studies senior advisor, actually still senior advisor, but he's the director of studies there. He's a man that knows a lot. And of also him, he was actually the contrary. He advised me at the beginning, stay away from it. Are you crazy? No, stay away, this too, come down, But my big satisfaction with this, that when, apart of the help he gave me to understand the way the mechanism of the U.S. government, how it works, but my satisfaction was unbelievable when I gave him the book, at that time, the Italian version, and I was expecting, his call coming any moment, say, I told you should have stayed away from it, because this is not going to, he was, I believe, I hope he say oh my God, Stefano, what you wrote, meaning that he was partially, I want to say that you are convinced about everything, but at most, a lot of things convincing you too. And I want to thank, of course, Robert Miller, that is sitting there too, because he's not only the publisher of the book, he had the courage to publish this book in English, he's not only the translator, but he's an historian, and I saw how he was also in checking certain things that was reading to make sure that there were, the things were well, the reference was there, and he made I believe also the publication, the American version is actually more complete, because the Italians, how the Italians are. The Italians are not in the hurry when they should, and they are in the hurry when they shouldn't. And, and that's how it was with that. I am grateful to the Editori Riuniti, because they were the first one to say, yes, let's do this book. And they were incredible editors. I was lucky enough that Alessandro Sparatore, an editor there, he was Sicilian. So for me, I didn't have to explain a lot. He already knew certain things. But they were in a hurry. Instead, so I believe the Enigma Books version has certain things that were missing there, and it's important to have it. And then thanks to my friends that supported me, Jesse Walker, you just saw the video, he'd say, let's do it. And, he's a busy guy with his job and everything. And when the people do these things, you feel loved and taken care of. And all the people that gave me support. But, of course, this book will never happen if I want to thank my colleagues. That there is my deputy at La Voce di New York, Maurita. That, of course, when I was involved in the English version, I had to take care of time. All the work goes somebody else. I'm going to pay the price. But of course, they were supporting. Yes, let's do the book also in English. But then I have to thank my family, because this book is, whoever wrote a book knows the sacrifice that goes on the shoulder of the family and my children. Sienna, Louis, Greta. I have a third child. It's my sister's daughter, but for me it's my third child because she lived with us. At the time, she was living with us, actually, while I was preparing the book. So she suffered too, Greta, on this. And my wife, Robin, the love of my life, that is over there. She's Indian, but she wanted to be here. So in this case, there's no help in having some more time to recover in order for her to. Without them, so I really thank them, because without the patient love, Carlos Marcello will still be, not sleeping with the fish, because he slept, like I was saying, like he died in his own bed. But why this book is important, and I want to thank, it's last on the list, I want to thank Stefano Albertini at this Casa, because, take courage. When, the mafia, assassination of Kennedy, this is an institution, is dedicated to culture, art. I would call it to the beautiful of Italy. And when you have published a book that is about a mafioso that killed the president, you can have the reactions say, why you want to bring this to me? It wasn't a case. I mean, Stefano knows me from a long time. My son Louis started to crawl here in this house. We had the office here, and he was going around. But he was right away supportive and said, when the book is finished, you're going to present it here. And I think he understood why, and I think it's the same, the message. I think the truth is something that is like art. Art gives you truth. Now, when you see a nice, beautiful piece of art, when you see a nice exhibition here, when somebody comes here and talk about poetry or theater, Laura is there, art is the reason why we love art and we attract it is because in the moment our spirit think we finally are confronted with something that is truth. And they said, usually when we talk about other stuff, we sense, we smell, there's not always the truth, or somebody's trying to take us away. And I think my contribution with this book, and that's why I wanted to write it, was because I think that this country, the country that I love, I raising my kids here, the Americans, I became American too, it didn't have the truth. It's not that it didn't have it, because the institution in this country, formal institution, they found the truth. Like was mentioned before, Commission of Congress of the United States, put the truth there and say, here, America, can you handle the truth? They told you practically in 1979 who was behind. They didn't have the proof to take the person to court, but they showed but the country was no interest. And when I said the country, of course, was the media. I'm part of the media. And Stefano ordered me and say, oh, you are an American journalist with an Italian passport. I have also an American passport, and I am honored to be part of the media establishment here. I founded a paper, La Voce di New York, that is underwritten, protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. But we, journalists, we media, who had to give the truth to this country, didn't, and to the world, I would say. And that's why I wrote the book, because I didn't have any scoop. It's not that I found something that, oh, look what Vaccara. It's true that me, being Sicilian, I understood right away that there is no way that the most powerful mafia guy that ever existed in this country, the richest and the most powerful, I knew already that for what the Kennedys, especially Robert Kennedy, was doing to him, there was no way that he was not going to, especially if he cornered, especially if he didn't have any other resort to violence. So there were certain things I could understand, but I didn't find any, smoking gun or any document. Everything was out there on the internet. You can check it out. And you cannot connect anybody like you can connect Carlos Marcello with Oswald, with Jack Ruby, with David Ferry, that he's a person we didn't mention here, but he's a guy that you will see, maybe you will remember on Oliver Stone movie, Joe Pesci in Oliver Stone movie, JFK. Well, Oliver Stone was able to do a movie about JFK, bring it to New Orleans, so may practically bring you close to the truth, and then forget about Carlos Marcello. And that's an incredible story, right? But this book, there is not so you didn't need the 1,000 pages of other people's books. In 200 pages, I think, I try to make the truth so evident in the sense that it is not my truth, it's what Congress and other researchers did. To ask, this is how I ended the book practically, is to ask this question, why? Why the people, why, I don't know how many of you before to come here knew who Carlos Marcello was. You know probably Al Capone who was, Lucky Luciano. Why this name doesn't ring your bell? And just after reading a book like this, and I didn't know when I started the book, I was finishing the book, when I found out that Leonardo DiCaprio was putting his own money to produce a movie about Carlos Marcello. As soon as I found out that, I know that all America finally will find out who Carlos Marcello was. But this is something very important. Think it's very important for a country like this, for the oldest democracy and the most powerful, for sure, that you had to understand why your president was killed, by whom, and who covered up. And I finish with this. The mistake was this. There was the two characterization. Oh, Lee Harvey Oswald was the only nut that did this. Or, who knows, the Cuban, the Castrist, anti-Cuban Soviets, the CIA and so on, and they were all there, no? So, and somebody forgot to understand that who does the cover-up, because there is a big cover-up going on, the government practically, the FBI first, and all the other agencies. It's not necessary. Maybe they are complicit. There is somebody maybe complicit. Now there is suspect on the vice president, but we'll see. But it's not necessary that who organized the cover-up is responsible for the killing. That's what has to be clear. The mafia kills because knows the reason why the mafia kills when it has a target, has the bravery, the courage, in quotes, of course, to go and hit the president of the United States, because it's certain that will not be punished. And they knew about the cover-up that was going to happen. So this is what my book does not reveal yet. And we are still to find out. I give some ideas, but what we have to still find out, that those are the documents that even Obama put there top secret. It will not show you, even President Barack Obama, like all the other presidents before, is why the government insisted on the cover-up from the first day of the assassination to today. That's what we know who practically there was not only Oswald. If Oswald was a patsy or not, if he shot or not, I don't think it's important anymore that. What is important today for our democracy is why we did the cover-up. So when we will, that's probably the reason the government of the United States, even when Congress in 1979 was trying to understand better, that's why maybe the truth is so bad on the reason why the government didn't tell us the truth, even if they maybe didn't commit the crime. They were not responsible, but they covered who was responsible. Thank you very much.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you questions, so we have one here and one back there. Please, maybe you want to say your name first.
My name's Christopher Williams. You indicated that you could not find a smoking gun. Now, like many people in the room, I know a lot about this case. And I was hoping to hear some kind of hard evidence. I mean, anything, a meeting, a statement. What I'd like to know is, do you have any evidence linking him to this? And if you could give us 90 seconds of just what the evidence is. And while you gather your thoughts about that, let me just say, no one at the top believed this, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Johnson didn't believe it. Bobby Kennedy didn't believe it. Hoover didn't believe it. Richard Russell wouldn't even sign a statement as a Warren Commission member that he'd been a lone gunman. So if Marcello was in charge of this, and if there was a second gunman, did you find any evidence of that?
Thank you. Stefano.
The evidence was not there. The evidence, the smoking gun in the 24th or the 26th of November 1963. But later on, the latest is, for example, the Hartman book, the Walden book, and that they do in the movie, is that there is a confession, apparently, by Carlos Marcello in prison. Carlos Marcello had to be in prison for some time, not for of course, he never was put on trial, for the Kennedy assassination, but he was on trial for corruption of judges and so on. And he went in prison, and when he was in prison, the FBI, for other reasons, they were trying to see how Marcello was still operating his organization from prison. They were able to put an informer inside, in his cell, and they became practically a confidant. And we have practically documents were found, documents of this informant saying, this guy is telling me that he killed Kennedy. This is, for example, to tell you one. Then, like he was, for example, the Jack Ruby was somebody that worked on for Carlos Marcello. This is also found out. There are FBI documents that link Carlos Marcello with Ruby, and not only Carlos Marcello with Ruby, I mean, in Dallas. Practically all the operation, the mafia operation in Dallas, was under the influence of Carlos Marcello. That was also getting the money from everything that was. Ruby was the one traveling with, bringing the money every 2-3 months. He was there also, in fact, in the summer of '63. You write that there is could this stand on trial? Could you make Carlos Marcello on a trial and condemn him? Probably not. But why? This is my question. I don't need, after 50 years, he's dead anyway. It's not a matter of finding justice, in a sense, putting somebody in prison. Is why this country shouldn't know the so-called historical truth. You know, the law sometimes is something historical truth, something something that you can put somebody on trial or condemn it. We know that maybe probably O.J. Simpson was responsible, and 100 years from now people say, oh, O.J. Simpson maybe was responsible, but he never paid on trial. The same. What I would like to know, that tomorrow, hopefully, they will come out, that document that they keep secret, because there are about a few thousand still that they hold it. They will say that FBI knew who was responsible, and they did the cover-up, and why. And I know for sure, I know because when you link when you can link Oswald and Ruby with Carlos Marcello, because like I said, my presentation of my book at the UN is saying, until Ruby doesn't appear, he's not in the picture, you can actually believe, like the Warren Commission, that only a nut, a former Marine, was there shooting and killed the president. Okay? But when somebody like Jack Ruby, that all Dallas knew that he was working for the mafia, is the guy that kills Oswald, well, unless you have to believe in many coincidences. And in that moment, I think that the country should be didn't need the 50 years, actually didn't need even 20 years. Right away, and a big question, I leave it there, I drop it, is why Robert Kennedy, that was still the Attorney General for a few months when the president is killed, Robert Kennedy is still the Attorney General. Why, like the son, you remind, Professor Lapormara reminded that the son, in that interview, is convinced, he says something more. In that interview with Charlie Rose, Robert Kennedy Jr. say, my father, I have it in the book anyway, my father, when Jack Ruby killed Oswald, asked to the FBI to provide right away all the telephone numbers that guy had called in the last 2 months. And when he received the document, and this you can find on YouTube, Robert Kennedy Jr. saying that, my father said to his staff in the Justice Department, these are the same people that I was calling when I was part of the committee investigation on organized crime. Practically was saying, these are the Marcello's people. And the question, I leave it there, is why Robert Kennedy, that was the Attorney General still, he knew who killed his brother, why he didn't act then? And why he died in 1968?
I think Professor Lapormara wants to add something, and then we have another question.
Very quickly, I just wanted to, I think it's a basic question you're raising, and I think the answer to it is there is no smoking gun, and most of the evidence is circumstantial. And the reason I'm impressed by this book is not because I have found hard evidence in it, but only because if you really accept some idea that circumstantial evidence can begin connecting some dots for you, if I were pressed to say who is the most probable person here, I would really agree that it's Marcello. Stefano mentioned the fact that I happened at one point to run into the man who was the chief counsel for Jimmy Hoffa, and he bent my ear between Little Run in Detroit and National Airport in Washington, and what he had to say about the, if nothing else, the vindictiveness of the Attorney General with regard to his client was pretty hair-raising. Now, even if I had discounted 75% of what this lawyer was saying to me, it remained very hair-raising. And so when I read in this book about the kind of single-mindedness with which the Attorney General goes after this particular man, that helped me to connect a few dots.
He went that way after Hoffa.
Yes.
So why not Hoffa?
Hoffa was not mafia.
Maybe Hoffa told him to do it.
Maybe so, but you know what? But Hoffa and Marcello, unless this is hearsay, but I read it in Stefano's book, they both put up $500 million in '60 to help defeat the president, Kennedy's campaign for the presidency. So these two guys really knew each other, and this particular lawyer was also the lawyer not of Marcello but of Trafficante.
Yes, in that point.
And you know, it's a very small group, and
I forgot to mention something in my presentation. That is why this book, why it came up to me. Okay, I call myself a student of the mafia in the sense I'm interested not really on the mafia, like, you know, the mafia itself, but the relationship of the mafia with power, with politics, and how George mentioned it in the Godfather. You see this, why the Godfather is the only mafioso there, and all the others are not, because the others cannot get the connection that the Don Vito Corleone has. I think that you can have politics without the mafia. You cannot have the mafia without politics. Real mafia. I don't think that all the people that you mentioned, I don't think Jimmy Hoffa was a mafioso. He tried, but he was not a real mafioso. He was in continual confrontation. A mafioso is not in continual confrontation. He's not on trial all the time. I think John Gotti died in prison. He's against the mobs, they're very dangerous. But he wasn't the real mafioso. A real mafioso is the guy that you don't know his name, like Carlos Marcello, and he has in a recording, FBI recording, we can hear it, those survive, where he says practically that he has in his pocket the mayor, congressmen, senators, governor of all the states he control. And to finish with what I didn't mention in my presentation is the reason why I did this book is because my interest and because I teach in a course on the mafia at Lehman College, CUNY. And on the beginning of the course, I leave papers. And one student, one of the first courses I taught, he was saying, I want to do a research on if the mafia is involved in the Kennedy assassination. Now, I knew, of course, that there are suspected things, but I let him do it. And he came up with this paper where he was saying practically the mafia did it. And then he mentioned Carlos Marcello. So I did a test the next semester, and I say, everybody not pick anymore the paper, everybody has to do the same paper. You have to do a research on who you think killed President Kennedy. Of course, it's a class on the mafia, so of course the students now think like, oh, is it? But and I say, you don't have one. Nobody has the answer yet. So, I mean, this is the official answer, that he's Lee Harvey Oswald. You can come up with your answer. Well, I still have a lot of papers in my house, and it's astonishing with the research skill of students that are 19, 20, 21 years old, that about a percentage, an average, I would say about 85, 90% came up with Carlos Marcello be behind. Then you're right, wasn't alone. It doesn't have to be alone. In the book, I don't say Carlo Marcello was the only one. He killed it. No, I just say, for what I can see is that for sure, I think that he's involved. Then if he's with him, with the Hoffa and the Trafficante, or with the president, after the Kennedy assassination, President Johnson, I mean, at that time, the vice president, this is something that we will find out when finally the president, the next president of the United States, because this president didn't want to tell us, will finally release those documents. I don't know with whom Carlos Marcello killed the president, because, somebody must out. But for what is out there, I think that I could, put it this way, I could bet everything I have. No, I'm not going to bet my wife and my children, but let's say my house, my job, yes, I will bet for that.
I think we have time only for one question here, and I hope it's a question with a short answer.
I'm not going to answer.
Well, it's about Lamar Waldron, because he's actually written 3 books, and if you add them all up, it's probably 3,000 pages. He goes into incredible detail to provide a lot of the answers that you were leaving open for us, and that is who benefited from the assassination, who hated Kennedy, and when you look at the cover-up, almost every institution of power was pissed at John Kennedy, and they wanted him gone. And they all benefited when he was gone, from the warmongers in Vietnam, the CIA, even the Federal Reserve, and the Texas oil men. So did you know Lamar, I'm assuming. I've met him a few times. He's a phenomenal investigator. Did you come up with anything from his research that you left? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, in my book, I quote him all the time, all his research. What I tried, you see, those books, like Lamar's book, is very important because other people, the researchers that went in the archive, and they were like the document I mentioned about the confession of Carlos Marcello in prison. They went there because they spent. I wish I had. I didn't have the time to spend years and years of my life, 15 years, I believe, in this case. But what I think I accomplished is you are expert, I believe, on the assassination. And so you put in this way, you maybe didn't need my book. But, sorry, I'm not interested in you in particular, in the sense, you know all these things. My question, like I tried to say, is why the country doesn't? Why, if I was going around knowingly in New York, me and Stan, we were once in, remember, the Chinese restaurant. There was a guy that would look like in the barman. This Chinese looked like somebody, wise. And because we talked, do you know about the mafia? Oh, yeah, well, I started to talk about a lot of things going on in the past, in the present. And then we say, do you know who Carlos Marcello was? This guy was probably in his 60s. He never heard it. That's why I wrote the book. I'm saying, I believe as a scholar, if you want to use a heavier word than student, but who is interested in the relationship between power, politics, and the mafia. That's the example I do to my students. You have a tank with a fish. The fish is the mafia, and the water is the politicians and everybody. If you take the water out of the tank, what happens to the fish? They die. That's what the Judge Falcone was trying to tell us. The mafia is a human phenomenon, and it's not so hard to get rid of it. You just need to stop that. Take out the water. Marcello died in his bed because he was able to get out of prison because he was a fish in the tank.
I know you have probably dozens more questions for Stefano and Joseph La Palombara and George De Stefano, but we have absolutely no time. You want to say something?
Could I make a brief
announcement?
I just wanted to inform everybody here who is interested in this topic that the John D. Calandra Institute of the City University of New York from April 24th to April 26th is holding a conference called Mafias. And while most of the panels and presentations will focus on the Italian mafia, it also is looking at transnational organized crime as well. Stefano will be speaking about his book at the conference, and I also will be there. And we will have also some people involved with the struggle against the mafia in Italy speaking as well at this conference. So that's April 24th to the 26th.
Thank you very much. The Calandra Institute for Italian American Studies. Thank you very much. This is very opportune that we are informed of this. I would like to thank Stefano. I think his book, the greatest merit is that it raises questions. It doesn't give answers, and some of them he leaves them open, and he captures our attention in an incredible way. I would like to thank George De Stefano and Joseph La Palombara for having participated in this discussion, and I invite you to come back to the Casa for our next event. Have a great evening, and remember that the books are for sale upstairs. Thank you, both in Italian and English.